that actually comes from a report in the Times of Malaya. It's an anecdote that relates to a very specific event that took place in September 1913. In September 1913, the colonial authorities decided to honor Sultan Idris Shah of Perak, because he was a very good sultan. He didn't rebel, he didn't send out all his, Maharajas and Datos to go and kill some poor colonial officer while he was doing his toilet by the river. He didn't do these sort of nasty things. He was a good guy. He went to London. He attended the coronation of the king. And he was a very, in those days, what they would call a progressive monarch. So he was a progressive monarch, and so they decided to honor him with a title, a pingat. And the pingat was the order of the Knight Grand Cross of the Victorian Order, GCVO. And at that time, this was the highest award ever given to a Malay Sultan. Now, for me, what's interesting about this particular event was how it was orchestrated. Because in the orchestration of this event, symbolically, we can see precisely the process of staging that I'm talking about, the arresting of the other, to give the other a very specific, fixed, and permanently fixed meaning. So I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the report by Thomas Fox, who was the editor of the Times of Malaya in those days. The Times was based in Ipoh, and Thomas Fox was there, so he went all the way up to Kuala Kangsar to witness the staging of this event when Sultan Idris was about to be given the medal. So in his report he states that, I quote, "The idea, broadly, was to convey the impression that the insignia, the GCVO, had come direct from the King of England to the Sultan in his palace at Kuala Kangsar." Unquote. Now, to achieve this theatrical event, colonial rules were very spectacular. There was always a need for a demonstration of power, so they were always staging these sort of symbolically coded events all the time. So they recruited everyone. So apparently, for this particular spectacle, there were a few hundred Malay warriors, swordsmen, spearmen, and the royal bodyguard, palace officials, flag bearers, ulama, qadis, hajis, actors and other entertainers, school children, of course, several dozen buffaloes, and a host of 70 huge elephants. Now, so even the animals were brought in to witness, this event. Now, what I found interesting was his report of how the event was originally meant to be staged, because it was meant to convey a very clear message to the public watching it. So I continue reading his report. It was first intended to make these celebrations more elaborate. After a riverside landing, the original suggestion allowed for an attack by rebel spearmen on the party bearing the insignia, led by the Colonial High Commissioner. This being an acknowledgement of past fighting days before the peaceful settlement of the country, when life was held cheap and death was faced every hour of the day, when rapine and murder were rife and progress stifled. Days of semi-barbarism. Whenever I read this passage, I'm thinking about the justification for the intervention into Iraq at the moment. Same sort of logic at work. Let's go there to save the natives. It's very interesting to see how the symbol of the medal, the GCVO, was meant to symbolize order itself. And this order was being brought all the way from London to Kuala Kangsar by boat, by elephant, and that with the coming of this symbol of order, life would be settled. An acknowledgement of past fighting days before peaceful settlement. And of course, it portrays the image of Perak, which today, I don't know how many of you are from Perak, by the way. Kuala Kangsar is not exactly the hottest place on earth, maybe temperature-wise, but it's not that exciting. But in those days, it was like a hotbed. It was presented as this hotbed of nasty, rebellious natives who go around with spears and krisses. Nowadays, they just do that at the Umbrella Assembly. But the ceremony somehow demonstrated the fact that in the context of the empire, the mindset of empire with a capital E, there were no longer private spaces. That every single corner of the empire, even out there, in the Hutan of Kuala Kangsar, there was order. And this order was being imposed from without. And why was this order imposed? Because the natives are restless. The natives are moving. They're doing things they're not meant to do. So when you look at how the ceremony was carried out, we have this depiction of Sultan Idris standing there inert, immobile, facing the river, watching the spectacle, waiting for the commissioner to come and pin this trinket on his chest, and the Sultan is powerless. And so we have here a typical example of the sort of Orientalist discourse that was being used at the time to depict the exotic Asian other, the native other, as this ambiguous, ambivalent entity that somehow had to be arrested. And this is what I mean by epistemic arrest. It's not just that he was physically arrested, he can't move, he's standing there on the stage, paralyzed and powerless. But even as an idea, the idea of the Sultan was that he was someone with no agency left. Agency was being imposed on him. And this fixity is actually one of the key components of governmentality. The idea that you have to fix and control and arrest both physically and epistemically the subjects under your dominion. And it's a theme that runs right from the colonial period to the post-colonial period. Because still today, like I said earlier, when we look at our National Day parades, we reiterate the same theme of fixity. We fix ourselves, we fix our communities and give them fixed, determined identities. So the epistemic arrest and the physical arrest of the colonized subject becomes a leitmotif against which this whole colonial construct was based. And we see this reflected not only through spectacles like this, but also through practically every adjunct and aspect of colonial rule at the time. We see this in the urban planning that takes place in many of the colonial capitals, Ipoh, Kuala Lumpur, Penang, Georgetown, Singapore, Malacca. And we see this in the way in which colonized cities were redesigned to actually physically arrest the natives, to keep them in their place. Hence the emergence of things like Chinatown, Little India. And today, of course, the tourist ads say, wow, so cool, Malaysia, we got a little Chinatown, we got a little India, we got a reserve land for the Malays, Kampung Baru, and we celebrate this. But we forget that in the 19th century, this was part and parcel of colonial governance. The idea that people who were actually living together were then moved out. So you guys, you stay here, you stay there, and you stay there, and we'll keep you apart. And this is then represented, repackaged to us as part and parcel of the propaganda of the time to somehow reinforce the idea that this is a plural society and that everyone is happy. And that the points of contact, the interfaces where the communities actually overlapped were being diminished all the time. One peculiar feature, and I've done this when looking at colonial urban planning in Indonesia as well, one peculiar feature of colonial urban planning is that less and less emphasis is put on common public spaces where people can come together. So there's less and less emphasis on parks, playgrounds and markets. And look at Malaysia today, and it's the same thing. Every time you see a park or a playground where Malaysians of all communities can come together, some rich guy will come and build a shopping center there instead. So we take away, we diminish these interfaces where overlapping can take place. So the first step taken in trying to actually construct the idea of race difference in Malaysia was precisely that, to fix the natives first. And it comes out in so many forms. Punk's not here, he's lurking somewhere out there, but one of the things we're going to do, hopefully in August, is we're going to do like small exhibitions of the postcards and posters that were produced during this time. And postcards are very interesting because a lot of postcards of Malaysia were produced. And the postcards were in two forms. One, buildings, which celebrated basically the colonial architecture of the time, and the other postcards were quote-unquote native studies, where you would like drag someone out, say, okay, put on your native dress, stand there, they take a photo of you, and they put a caption and you say Malay. This is what Malay looks like. And then they put someone else, put on a sari, or that, and it says Indian. And the postcards are a very good indicator of how we were framed then. And funnily enough, we frame ourselves today as well at the National Day Parade. You look at the postcards that were produced from the late 19th century and you look at our National Day Parade today, you will see that what I mean by colonial governmentality has not changed. It is so deeply embedded in our society. Now, the second instrument that was used to actually concretize this sense of racial difference and ethnic difference was the colonial census. And I'll refer you to now, some of you may have this, it's this summary of the colonial census that was done. Now, one of the things that you do when you colonize a country is that you better start learning how to divide and rule very quickly, because otherwise, normally, colonizing powers are a minority. Let's remember that all of India was ruled by about 10,000 British bureaucrats, and all of the Dutch East Indies was governed by no more than 7,000. So how do you maintain your structures of power and dominance when you're clearly in the minority? Well, one of the ways you can do that is actually by dividing these communities apart. And all of this was done through a host of very peculiar, very interesting pseudo-scientific theories and instruments, one of which was the census. Now, if you look at the census here, and these are taken from Charles Hirschman's studies on the use of the colonial census and the construction of race in colonial Malaysia. If you look at the census, the first census was in 1871. There's another one in 1891, 1911, and 1931. Now, the way in which the census worked was this. You have precisely this sort of gamut of hybrid communities out there doing things they're not supposed to do, like being nice to each other and falling in love with each other. And you don't want that, because you want to keep them apart. Now, how do you do that? You lump all these categories together into general headings. And if you look at the way the colonial census worked from 1871, it already began lumping all these communities into general groupings. So there would be one grouping for Europeans, there would be another one for Malays, Indians, and Chinese. Now, what is interesting is when you look at how the colonial census worked, it actually integrated different communities and lumped them together into these very broad general headings. Look at the 1871 census, the first one on your left, and you'll see that under Malay, they put together Boyanese, Bugis, Dayaks, Javanese, Jawi Pekans, Malays, Mandela men, and other communities. At the time, you'll notice that the category of Chinese was left blank. So basically, everyone could go into that community. Hindus, including Bengalis and Indian races, not specified. It becomes more and more complicated as things go on. By the time of the 1911 census, just look at how wide and abstract the category of Malay was, especially the census that was done in the Strait settlements, Penang, Singapore, and Malacca. Practically everyone's there: Acehnese, Ambonese, Balinese, Bandung, Banjaris, Batak, Borneo, Boyanese, Bugis, Bundu, Dayak, Dusus. Now, honestly, you don't have to be an ethnographer to tell you that a Batak and a Javanese are not Malay. That's like saying I take a Dutchman and a Mexican and I call them Japanese. It's about as ridiculous as that. They are so culturally and historically apart, and yet you see, with the use of these general categories, the differences in between the communities were being diminished. And there are two negative consequences that come out of this. The first negative consequence is that with the construction of general categories of Malay, Chinese, and Indian, obviously you have the diminishing of difference and the failure and the unwillingness to accept the fact that these are actually very distinct communities, even with different languages, by the way. Japanese and Batak have two completely different linguistic systems, culturally apart, but you've lumped them together under a general category of Malay. So what you've done is you've simplified, you've reified the subjects under your dominion, under your control. Now, of course, the construction of these general categories was meant to fit into a logic of a violent hierarchy, because these are not just distinct races. They are superior races and they're inferior races as well, and that's why you categorize them like this. Now, all of this, of course, takes place at the time when the logic of race grows popular in Europe. And with the logic of race becoming popular, you have a whole host of pseudo-scientific theories that were equally popular at the time. Remember, this is the time when eugenics began to appear in Europe. This was the time when a bunch of pseudo-scientists, all getting very dubious medical degrees from Stalingrad or places like that, were coming up with very odd theories of racial difference and racial superiority. This was the time when in Europe you had the debate about superior races and inferior races as well, concerns about Jews, concerns about gypsies, all emerged at this time, this period, this crucial period of the mid-19th to early 20th century. So the concept of race, which is part and parcel of the race politics of Europe, was being imposed in Southeast Asia as well. And a violent hierarchy is constructed between superior races and weaker races. Another popular theory at the time in Malaysia, in British Malaya in particular, was the theory of native autogenocide. Now, I wonder how many of you have heard about this theory. The theory of native autogenocide was a slightly more elaborate theory that evolved from the simpler theory of racial difference. The theory of racial difference simply suggests that somehow people of different communities are genetically different from each other. The theory of autogenocide, native autogenocide, suggests that some species are meant to survive and some are meant to die. And so you have certain native races that were dubbed weaker races or feminine races that were meant to die out. This was a theory that was very popular in South America at the time. It was also very popular in Australia because for some peculiar reason, Aborigines were dying in large numbers. And it was assumed that they died simply because they are weak, and when you put them in contact with stronger races, they just sort of fade away. The fact that they were being shot never came into, was never taken into consideration. I don't know, they just stand in front of a bullet for no reason. And in the context of British Malaya, the theory of native autogenocide was used to explain why the Malays in particular were dying out and why they were being slowly wiped out by the more industrious races. So already you have this very odd and very dangerous contradiction. You've divided the communities and then you've posited the idea that some of these communities are stronger than others, and so this justifies in turn the colonial presence. The colonial presence has to be there to protect some of the weaker races. And who do you protect? You protect the Malays. So you give them reservation land and you give them special endowments and special privileges. Today, it's the UMNO party who uses the same sort of language. And that's where all of this comes from. That's the history of this. Yeah? That's the context, that's the historical context to where this sort of racialized thinking comes from. It emerges at a time where imperialism, colonialism, race politics and racism were ripe. And that shaped the social landscape of Malaysian society. The second, and for me, equally important and equally sad aspect of the colonial census, as you see, it's all encompassing. Everyone kena masuk, there's no escape. Everyone gets put in somewhere in there. But you'll notice some funny categories that hop from one census to another, like the Jawi Pekans. These are the Jawi Peranakans. And the Peranakan Chinese, the Peranakan Indians, the Peranakan Arabs, the Peranakan Eurasians, the Sranis were always a problem for the census makers because you don't know where to put them. You don't know where to put these guys because they are neither this nor that. And the logic of the census, which by definition has to divide, does not take fractions. You cannot be 0.5 Malay, 0.5 Chinese. You have to be 1 Malay or 1 Chinese. You can't be both, you see. And what the colonial census did in time was not only did it reify these communities into these three general headings, Malays, Chinese and Indians, it also slowly eliminated and eroded the space for these hybrid communities that were both. And unfortunately, to compound the problem even further, by the late 1920s, the 1920s and 1930s, with the emergence of anti-colonialism and nationalism that emerged in Asia also reflected the logic of race. So many of the anti-colonial movements, even here in Malaysia, were race-based. Hence you have UMNO, MCA. They were race-based. And they too did not leave space for those who were hybrid. And for me, the saddest aspect of this history is the history of the Peranakan Chinese of Indonesia, who were, at the time, perhaps the most cosmopolitan community in Southeast Asia. If you look at the history of the Peranakan communities of the Pesisir coast, the north coast of Java, and places like Pekalongan, Kedung Muni, Cirebon, Surabaya, these were communities that were, on the one hand, comfortably Indonesian and comfortably Chinese. And they could be both. You could be Chinese and Pribumi at the same time. There was nothing wrong with that. You could speak Bahasa, you could trade with your partners in Singapore or Bangka, you had your cosmopolitan links to Europe and China, and you were firmly rooted in Indonesia. They were comfortable. But with the rise of Indonesian nationalism and the introduction of new race laws that were introduced, particularly in Indonesia between 1924 to 1934, laws that forbade people of different races from marrying each other, this Peranakan community, Peranakan Arabs, Peranakan Chinese, Peranakan Eurasians, had to choose. And for the Peranakan Chinese in particular in Indonesia, with the rise of Chinese nationalism that was race-based in China, they were basically told, you are now either with us or against us. What are you? Are you Indonesian or Chinese? So many of them were forced to make this fateful decision. And that's what the colonial census did. It forced people to take sides. And while the census was being developed and made even more sophisticated, a new range of laws were introduced, both in British Malaya and British Burma, but particularly in the Dutch East Indies, in Indonesia, and to some extent also in Indochina, French Indochina, that made it more and more difficult for mixed couples to meet, to have relationships, or to even marry. And this is why, when we look at the material history of Indonesia, the use of batik. Batik was a dress worn by everyone, including the Dutch. By the 1930s, the Dutch stopped wearing batik because there were laws that gave them different privileges and different status compared to the Indonesians. And so all the common interfaces that kept them together, the lingua franca of Bahasa Indonesia, batik, which was universal dress by everyone, you know, the Indon Pribumis, the Chinese, the Indians, the Arabs, and the Europeans, this became diminished. And one by one, slowly, step by step, we reverted into our ethnic ghettos. And this is now reflected again in Malaysia and Indonesia, and to some extent in Burma, with the sort of racial pageantry that we perform for ourselves every year on National Day. If you look at the photos from British Malaya, British Burma, Singapore, Indonesia at the time, you see a completely different social landscape. I recommend you, I'm going to sound like a traitor now, but I'm going to recommend you to take a quick trip to Singapore, where the Peranakan Museum has just been set up on Armenian Street, and you just look at the photos of all these Peranakan communities who are neither this nor that. There's a wonderful photo of an Indian Peranakan family where the husband is in Indian dress and the bride is wearing a Chinese dress. And this was the norm then. People played, you invented yourself as you went along. The census prevented this. The census made it more and more difficult, and that you have to choose. You have to choose. You couldn't be both Malay and Chinese. You couldn't be both Chinese and Indian. You had to be either one. And this was then reflected in the political choices that people made in their daily lives, including the sort of political activism that emerged as a result. Which brings us now to the state of Malaysia today. Now, why did we begin with this rather lengthy historical introduction? The point I'm trying to make is that it is, I think, a contradiction, a fundamental contradiction, a tragedy, in fact, of all post-colonial societies, that immediately after the end of colonialism, practically all of them, from Africa to South Asia to Southeast Asia, we have all these post-colonial governments that end up replicating and repeating and perpetuating exactly the same sort of governmentality that was prevalent during the colonial times. So much of what we see in Malaysia today reflects really the colonial setup then. Now let's look at this very, very carefully. The mistake, I believe, that we made in 1957 was that we tried to build a plural, democratic, multiracial Malaysia on the basis of what was then a colonial economy. Colonial economies are not democracies. Colonial economies are colonies. And the difference between a colonial economy and a democracy, a plural democracy, is that a colonial economy is constructed upon a completely different set of premises. Mode of politics that is divisive, that is meant to perpetuate a violent social hierarchy that places some groups above others, that is only perpetuated with the threat of force and violence. That's why there were all these barracks all over the place. I live in Ampang, there are all these old colonial barracks still there. Why? Because they're there to make sure everyone stays in line. That's why they're there, you see. They're there to make sure you stay in line. And the nature of colonial capitalism then was that it was racialized capitalism. And that's why the census was so important. By dividing Asian society against each other, and by creating these concrete, sedimented ethnic blocks, you could then appropriate duties and functions to each block. So you would say that, these poor Malays who are about to die out anyway, let's give them something easy to do, like plant rice, because if you give them hard work, they're going to die even faster. So we'll give them simple things like be a nelayan, grow padi, that sort of stuff. We forget, for example, that up to 1870, half of the tin being produced in Perak was being produced by Malay freeholders. and this is never mentioned in the history books, especially the colonial history books. So you create the fiction, You see, again, go back to the colonial postcards. Whenever there's a picture of a Malay, the Malay is always holding a jangkol, Malay is always holding a jangkol. And then, and the idea that every community has a specific function. Likewise, we forget that the Malaysian countryside was once covered with Chinese villages. There were Chinese who were farmers. Today everyone's so freaked out about babi farms all over the place. Yeah, but Chinese were a significant factor in the agricultural economy of Malaysia, and they lived in the land. They had an agrarian culture, but this is diminished. This is always diminished in history books. Why? Because you want to create the notion that the Chinese are primarily urban-based. They all live in cities, and they're all towkes and businessmen. Yeah. And likewise, what happened to the Indians? Indians, in particular, were divided because much of the mode of governing the Indian minority in Malaysia, or Malayans of Indian origin, was determined by the logic of race politics that came from British India, where there was a slightly more sophisticated logic at work that divided Indians between the martial races and the feminine races. So if you are a Punjabi or a Sikh, then you go into the army. They give you a gun because you're a macho guy. You're genetically so. But if you're Bengali, forget it. Bengalis can't do that. Bengalis, you give them a pen because they make, they do like kitty work, that sort of stuff. And then if you're Tamil, of course, you're right at the bottom. And this whole hierarchy, this is a violent hierarchy, was constructed and perpetuated, and it is still perpetuated in Malaysia today. So the root of all these gripes, when you look at what happened with the Hindraf rallies and all that, these things have a long historical story to each of them, and we need to deconstruct this history. And so we now need to look at Malaysia today, and to ask ourselves, some very interesting and I think some timely questions about how and why, despite everything, we have not evolved since 1957.